Hey nerds. Continue my series on Habermas's philosophical discourse of modernity. Of course, Habermas, famous 20th century critical theorist in the Frankfurt School, not to be confused with critical race theory, although dumbass public intellectuals like pseudo-intellectual crackpots like former mathematician James Lindsay, who I often criticize, and Jordan Peterson and many others
Jordan Peterson.
say that critical race theory and critical theory are the same thing, even though one has to do with politics and is often conflated with cultural Marxism, which isn't even actually a thing, and the other of which is about race and doesn't have to do with Marxism really much at all. But anyway, so the critical theorists in the Frankfurt School had some very interesting thoughts, and like as I was alluding to before, they are some philosophers and some people incorrectly, in my opinion, label as cultural Marxists, but that's not even what most people mean, or like, actual philosophers who talk about these things, that's not what they mean. They basically, if you're talking about the critical theorists in the Frankfurt School, they weren't ideological political Marxists. They analyzed the cultural effects of the remnants of the cultural effects of Marxism that still remained in modern Western culture after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the communist totalitarian regimes, basically, right? And so he's talking about Hegel here. And of course, I've talked about Hegel many times before, famous 18th and 19th century German idealist who wrote Phenomenology of Spirit, very seminal philosophy book in terms of metaphysics. So he obviously studied metaphysics along with many other subjects. And so he's going to get in. So we get into Habermas's opinion here of basically his criticism of Hegel in terms of rationalism and how we define reality, and I think makes some brilliant criticisms of him too. And we get into a few ideas here that I've mentioned in my boy Hegelian slash Lacanian slash Marxist philosopher Slavoj Žižek. And in when he's talking about Hegel, because as I said, he was a Hegelian slash Lacanian slash Marxist philosopher. So he was very like agrees with a lot of Hegel's opinions, but he also has some great criticisms. And we get into a few of the criticisms of Hegel that he mentioned himself in his book Less Than Nothing, that I've also been doing a series on. So we'll get into his opinion of Hegel is right within this paragraph of Habermas, the critical theorist, opinions on, well, basically, he's outlining a criticism of Hegel that I think is a very valid one. So, anyway, let's get into the paragraph. Hegel had hardly conceptualized the direction of modernity before the unrest and movement of modernity was ready to explode this concept. So, basically, he had barely defined and explained his concept of modernity before the concept was ready to explode and just, you know, get so extreme that it goes outside of the realms of reality of anything he thought to possibly prescribe, or not prescribe, describe in terms of modernity. And we're talking about, so we're not talking about modernity we're in the post-structuralist sense like that of Foucault and Derrida, right? But we are talking about something similar. What we're just talking about the modern era. So like modern Western Enlightenment culture, modern Western Enlightenment 20th century culture in terms of the critical theorists in the Frankfurt School, because they were writing in the 20th century, obviously, right? Okay, so that's kind of what they mean by modernity, basically. So, and the movement of modernity was ready to explode this concept basically barely after Hegel had begun to describe it. The reason for this is that he could carry out his critique of subjectivity only within the framework of the philosophy of the subject. So, remember, we got into in a section of Slavoj Žižek's Less Than Nothing, we get into Fichte's criticism no, wait, actually, it was Hegel's criticism of Fichte. So Fichte, who who basically had this metaphysical framework based on a philosophy of subjectivity, and that was very popular and taken up by many philosophers, as is often the case. But Hegel basically criticized this metaphysical framework from the lens of the philosophy of subjectivity, from the philosophy of the subject. So Hegel thought that Fichte was wrong for posing a metaphysical system based on subjectivity, and thought that the metaphysical system should be based on a philosophy of the subject rather than subjectivity. Okay, so where the power of division is supposed to be at work only so that the absolute can demonstrate itself as the power of unification. So we'll stop there. Power of division is supposed to be at work only so that the absolute can demonstrate itself as the power of unification. So this is the sort of paradox that many other philosophers before him and many idealists, including obviously principally Hegel and many others, get into. And Hegel talks about this in Phenomenology of Spirit and just in his writing in general, right? The power of division works only so that the absolute can be demonstrated itself as a power of unification. So paradoxically, the purpose of the purpose of division is to show the power of to show the power of unification. When we divide, like basically we divide this one whole into many parts, but the sum of its parts is still the whole. So the parts still make up one whole. That sort of paradox kind of thing that Hegel talks about, right? So where the power of division is supposed to be at work only so that the absolute can demonstrate itself as the power of unification. So if we talk about the absolute, it can unify divisions. So we unify divisions with the absolute through a philosophy of the subject, according to Hegel. So do you follow that? We use the absolute to in order to unify divisions. So we unify divisions with the philosophy of the absolute through a philosophy of the subject. Okay, so they're no longer so where the power of division is supposed to be at work only so that the absolute can demonstrate itself as the power of unification, there are no longer any quote unquote false positives, but only divisions that can also claim a relative right. So basically what it sounds like Habermas is saying there is that the ability of the absolute through a philosophy of the subject can only unify divisions if they rely on false positives. So false positives are necessary in order for the absolute to show the power of the power of the unification through division through the philosophy of the subject. So that's supposed to be the case, but since there are no false positives, then that means that we cannot use the absolute to figure out a philosophy of the subject by using division to show the power of unification. So there are no false positives, but only divisions that can also claim a relative right. So if the divisions are not false and they're real, then they can claim a relative right, then the division is actually, like, basically what you can say is the division is actually divided from the unification of the whole into the absolute. So you see, you can't actually get the absolute if there are if there are no false positives. You need the false positives to get to the absolute. So since there are no false positives, the divisions have the relative right, which means that you cannot get to the absolute with the philosophy of the subject, because the divisions cannot be unified. So if we can't unify the divided parts, then we cannot come to an absolute. So we cannot come to an absolute through a philosophy of the subject, which I think is a good criticism from Habermas of Hegel. So only divisions that can also claim a relative right. And emphatic institutionalism guided Hegel's pen when, in the preface to the Philosophy of Right, he declared the real to be rational. Yes, I think that's accurate. Emphatic institutionalism. Yeah, especially since, like, at the time that Hegel was writing, you could definitely say, if we're talking about rationalism, there was like so many philosophers during this Enlightenment period of history, like had huge hard-ons for rationality and would never shut up about it, and talked about rationality being real, right? So I agree that it's just emphatic institutional with Habermas's criticism that Hegel's emphatic institutionalism influenced him to declare that the real is rational. So, which obviously, as I've been through 1,000 times before, I don't think is necessarily true at all. Like, humans don't behave rationally, as I've talked about many times before, with in terms of, the moral and social psychologist Jonathan Haidt's moral foundation theory that has been, you know, added to, worked on, and popularized by other people like David Sloan Wilson, evolutionary biologist, and Joe Henrich, who I think is a sociobiologist. But anyway, we can be more rational, but humans in general do not behave rationally. And so even if if we assume, for the sake of argument, that we can understand objective reality, then it's not necessarily going to be rational, because like, that would mean that reality would have to, like, manipulate itself in order to cater to our expectations of it. Like, once we learn the aspects of reality, they seem rational, but that's just retconning it, because all of this shit that we didn't understand isn't rational until we make it rational, if that makes sense. But yeah, the point is that reality is not necessarily rational, and people are not necessarily rational. So we can't necessarily even determine what is rational or irrational. But anyway, that's a little bit beside the point. So, although it is somewhat involved to Habermas's criticism here. So, uh, so in Philosophy of Right, Hegel declared the real to be rational. Certainly, in the previous lectures from the winter semester of 1819 to 20, we find the weaker formulation: what is rational becomes real, and what is real becomes rational. You see that paradox there again? What is rational becomes real. So the rational becomes real, and the real becomes rational. Although, I guess, if you wanted to, yeah, if you want to give the most charitable possible explanation to this, and take it, uh, and try to look at it positively, because you can talk about how Hegel writes deliberately paradoxically in the Phenomenology of Spirit, and in German ideology in general, and just in Hegel's writing in general, like, not to mention obviously many other German idealists. But you could say that he was actually kind of saying what I was getting at there to an extent. And obviously that's not my original thought. That's that's not even his original thought. Plenty of philosophers have had this brilliant insight. But anyway, so what is rational becomes real. I would interpret that as what what we think is rational, we interpret it as real, and then it becomes real to us because we have supposedly used our rationality to discover what is real. But we decide that it's rational to see it as real before it's real, right? So what is rational becomes real, and what is real becomes rational. You see what I mean? We want we want we want the real to be rational. So we think that we use our rationality to discover the real, and then the real is rational because we've been correct about discovering what we expected to discover, because so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, basically, right? So I can totally understand Habermas's criticism that he's getting at too here, though, also, right? So you can't get to the absolute, because Hegel's philosophy of the subject fails, because the unifications cannot be defined, separated from the divisions, because there are no false positives. So again, we cannot get to the absolute through Hegel's philosophy of the subject. So Hegel's philosophy of the subject does not work. Agreed. However, I do agree with Hegel that what is rational becomes real, and what is real becomes rational, so to speak. That's how we see it. But even so, it's just basically our human bias. So the real is not actually obvious. Obviously, the real is not necessarily rational at all. We don't know. We can have a good idea and we can try to figure it out, but we want it to be rational. So we want the real to be rational. So we make it rational, decide it's rational, even if it makes no sense. A lot of reality makes no sense, like quantum physics and shit. That's not rational. That doesn't mean it's bad or wrong. It just means that it's not rational necessarily. What does rationality have to do with reality, really, right? It's kind of a human way of looking at things. So, anyway, so what is rational becomes real, and what is real becomes rational. But even this statement only opens up space for pre-decided prejudice present. That's true, right? So these are very interesting points. So we cannot arrive at the absolute through Hegel's philosophy of the subject. However, he's right that the rational becomes real, and what is real becomes rational because we decide that the real is rational, and then the real becomes rational. However, if we decide that the rational becomes real and then we make the real rational, this is also still a prejudiced, pre-decided present if we're agreeing with Hegel that the rational becomes real and the real becomes rational. So basically all it boils down to like three different types of biases from Habermas and Hegel at different levels, right? So yes, Habermas is right that you cannot get to the absolute with Hegel's philosophy of the subject. And it sounds like Hegel is right when he says the rational becomes real and what is real becomes rational. However, this is also actually just a bias because it's a prejudice. So we don't actually know that Hegel's actually correct about what that the rational becomes real and the real becomes rational. So maybe actually the real is rational and the rational is real and rationality is real. So that's really that's a really good thing, good aspect to point out of Habermas. So yeah, Hegel made many very good points, and so did Habermas and many of the other critical theorists in the Frankfurt School that I've gotten into before, right? So yeah, uh, Haber, Habermas is right that you cannot arrive at the absolute through Hegel's philosophy of the subject. So Hegel's philosophy, so Habermas eviscerates Hegel's pathetic philosophy of the subject because Hegel's philosophy of the subject fails to find the absolute. Hegel's philosophy of the subject fails to find the absolute. However, while it sounds good that when Hegel says that what is rational becomes real and what is real becomes rational, basically obviously implying that the real is not rational, he could be wrong because that's also his prejudice. So we cannot arrive at the absolute through Hegel's philosophy of the subject, but we don't actually know whether reality is rational or not, which makes more sense. We don't know. We can't trust our judgments to say that it's rational, but that means that we also can't necessarily, or that doesn't necessarily mean that it's irrational automatically. Like we don't know what's rational and irrational until we like do more further in scientific or any type of empirical investigation, right? So yes, Hegel's philosophy of the subject fails to find the absolute, and we do not have any fucking idea whether reality is rational or not. So is reality real? Is reality real? Who knows? Is reality rational? Is reality irrational? Who knows? We cannot arrive. We cannot. It sounds like we can never discover the absolute, and we can absolutely never know whether reality is rational or irrational.